The ideas expressed in the following presentations are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of ACI or its committees. ACI web sessions are recorded at ACI conventions or other concrete industry events and will be made available for viewing free of charge for 1 week. Thereafter, they will be archived on the ACI website or added to ACI's online CEU program, depending on their content.
My job today is to talk about the general requirements for 562, and I'll just try to take this very simple. I only have a few slides, but I want to address generally what's in chapters 1 and chapters 4. And these are primary chapters that set you up to use the code and to use the specifics that are addressed in other chapters. Chapter 1 is general provisions, and Chapter 4 is compliance. 562 is a concrete specific code for existing buildings. It addresses, and you'll note in the preface, the first thing that is said is we're addressing existing concrete members. So this addresses buildings and members, elements, systems, components. But it's specific to concrete structures. Works within the framework of the IEBC, and it's intended to also work as a standalone code. To do this means that we have to address a number of different issues. Some of these are, how do we use existing documents for loads and to give us the provisions that we need to address the design of repairs and rehabilitations. Generally, what I'd like to do is answer the questions of when is 562 applicable, when are updates required to the current building code, and this will be clarified a little bit more in the newer version of 562, which it's a developing document, is all I want to say. Right now, in the version that you have, which is the 2013 version, the document relies upon the licensed design professional to make a number of decisions for themselves as to how and when to apply the document. We'll try to be a little bit more specific in the newer version, and in order to do that, we'll give you some tools that will help you. And one of those tools you'll see, and I'll present, and that's a decision tree of when you need to choose a specific document and go to that for the information on how you're going to do your design and also how you're going to do your evaluation. I'll also try to show you a simple example, which is a flow chart that is intended for spreadsheet use and calculation assessment, which will help you look at why an original building code need not exceed the current building code, and what I mean by that statement. When is 562 applicable? It's applicable to buildings that have a building permit. If your building has been permitted, then 562 applies. If you have not yet received a certificate of occupancy, then you still fall under ACI 318. That's the distinction. That's where you draw the line here, is it has to be an existing structure with a certificate of occupancy. Structures that are permitted for use. 562 is a standard of care for evaluation, repairs, and rehabilitations. It's publicly reviewed, which means we went out and got comments from a number of different groups and individuals, sat down and went through everyone's comments, looked at those and responded to every single comment. And there were hundreds of them when we first started this document. Once we got it to a form that we could put it out for public review, we went out and addressed, before we published the document in its form currently, we addressed all those comments. That makes it a very important document, and one that is really necessary for the engineer to look at today that's evaluating an existing structure and say, what am I going to use? I have to use 562. It's the current standard of care, and I'm responsible, legally responsible, to use the current standard of care. The licensed design professional may view, and this is something that attorneys are talking to me about, and they're voicing their opinions, that is it possible that you want to view 562 as a pending 318 for existing buildings? I'll leave this up to the licensed design professional to answer for himself. It is possible, and legally may be a way that attorneys can look at it. 562 is the current standard of care applicable to existing concrete buildings and members. And don't just leave out the members, because sometimes we're asked to just review specific members and specific elements of the structure. And this applies to those members. You don't have to look at the entire structure. You can look at concrete porches on residential units. The licensed design professional is obligated to use 562 as a recognized, public reviewed document. When are updates to current building code required? There's only a few times when you actually need to use current building code requirements or provisions in your evaluation, repair, and rehabilitation of existing buildings. In the current document, 562 as a standalone code says that if a building or its elements, members, are unsafe, then you need to use the current code provisions to repair those elements. When you're using the IEBC or 562 alone also, if the building has substantial structural damage to vertical elements, and that's the limit, to vertical elements of the lateral systems when they are damaged by earthquake or wind loads, or to vertical elements of the gravity system. Then you have to, if there is a certain level of damage, which is defined in the IABC as substantial structural damage, the vertical elements then have to be repaired using current building code provisions. Right now, there are a number of times when using the current building code provisions are necessary for alterations and additions. And Gus will address this in a little bit more depth. And when they are being required, that you have to rehabilitate the existing structure or specific members using the current building code. The newer version, what we're working on right now in our committee, and I know all of you are involved probably in a lot of different committees where you're working on what's coming out in the future. We are also, and we're trying to clarify this for you to make it simpler and easier for you to use our document and to understand when it applies and how it interfaces with the original building code and the new code. In order for you to better understand this, we'll go with what's in the 2013 version, and we'll talk about a term that is basically unsafe elements or members or building components. This is what I've referred to here as a level 1 repair. A structure or individual member has significant risk of collapse under current service load levels. That means your structure, as it is being used today, has a certain service load demand that is required. If your strength is less than, and this is ultimate strength, is less than service load demand, then your structure is what's termed here a repair level 1 and is termed in the current document as being unsafe. Put this simply, this is nominal load capacity. It's significantly less than nominal service load demand. Demand capacity ratio is greater than 1. Repairs are to comply with current building code requirements and with 562. And when we say current building code requirements, we mean the current code requirements, okay, and they're presented in 562 in Chapter 5 as far as loads and fee factors that you would use. There is another level that we have left open to the licensed design professional to interpret for himself, but this is a range where what I'll refer to here as a level 2 repair, where a structure or individual member has a design strength less than the strength demand. This is what you normally design for in 318. You always have a strength capacity greater than the demand. If it's less than that, then you're into a range of questionable safety, and this in the future will hopefully be clearly defined to you and what you need to do for this particular case where the demand to capacity ratio is greater than 1. Your repairs would need to comply with the original building code requirements, with 562 excluding Chapter 5, which reference ASCE 7-10 loads and specific fee factors. When you are using new codes, use new fee factors or the fee factors in Chapter 5. When you're using the original building code, use load factors and fees that are from those original documents. Don't mix the two. One is not the other. try to make that very clear in the next version of the code. There is what would be an additional repair level 3. This is where the individual members and the structure have a strength greater than the strength demand. So your design capacity is greater than strength. That doesn't mean that you don't use 562 to design your repairs for your spalls and the topping of a parking structure, or spalls on the outside of a column. Don't correct for cover that's necessary on reinforcement. You could still use 562, and we'll be a little bit more specific about how you use 562 to in the future in chapters 1 and 4. You could still comply with 562 excluding chapter 5, and you'll find that the code, the new version, will have a few more provisions for you to draw upon for the design of these types of repairs. In the future, what you'll see is a design-based code. Perhaps number 1 will be current building code with 562, the original building code with 562 excluding chapter 5, which is current demand level loads, and the design basis code of 562 excluding chapter 5 as a standalone code where you need not, or you have already looked at safety provisions based on current building code or the original building code as are maybe applicable. So what we'd like to do in the future, and what you may find applicable even today, is to look and see how the design basis code is determined from a decision tree basis. So you start with an existing concrete structure, and I'll say structure, not just building, because you can apply this to a number of different structures. It is specifically written for buildings. Doesn't mean it's not applicable to slabs on grade or water tanks. Many of the provisions are still applicable, but this is left up to the licensed design professional to make that determination of how to apply this code. As you start into this decision tree, the first question you have is, has the local jurisdiction adopted the IEBC or an existing building code? This or an existing building code also includes IBC Chapter 34 if you're dealing with an older version, which most jurisdictions are at this point. If the answer to that is yes, you go down the left side of this decision tree and you start in using ACI 562 Chapter 4. If the answer to this is no, you go down the right side of the decision tree, use 562 Section 1.3. As you come down here, the next step is to do a preliminary evaluation. This evaluation is identified in the 562 document, and I've simplified it here as the design basis code is the original building code, not to exceed the current building code. In a lot of jurisdictions, the jurisdiction we're in, for example, the current building code provisions are less than the prior building code provisions. This is very true in Denver also, where I practice. The current building code, including the seismic maps and seismic provisions, have gone down. So we're currently dealing with loads for current provisions less than original design provisions of structures built in the 80s and 90s. So I'm going to give you a way to very quickly check this in a spreadsheet type scenario, and that'll be the last decision tree I take you through. On the left side, you'll come down into the IEBC, and you'll have the question of, does the lateral or gravity system, and this is the vertical elements of those systems, have substantial structural damage? If the answer to that is yes, then you use current building code requirements and provisions to strengthen those elements, and that's where your repairs are. If the answer to that is no, then you go down, and we'll cover that in the next slide. As far as the first question on the right side, the LR1, that's the question of safety. Is the structure safe? And the question actually there is the structure unsafe? And if it's yes, it's unsafe, you use current building code provisions. That's the branch to the right. If it's no, then you come down and you go over to the IABC provisions. As you come down on the left side, this is the IABC side, you'll go into then alterations and answer the question of, are additions or alterations requiring upgrading to the current building code? And that's the branch that goes off to the right and the yes. If you come down to the no, then the next question is, do you have some level of repair that is necessary to address as far as the safety and strength issue? If it is, then you can go to the original building code. If not, then it's up to you to decide whether you want to upgrade the structure or not. Why the design basis code determined need not exceed the current code? This is a decision tree that gives you the information that you could put into a spreadsheet to make decisions. You start again with a current structure, and the first question you ask is the original building code an option? If it is, then you come down the left side. This decision tree on the left side is what you might want to pay attention to. The note in the orange box up above is current building code provisions are the state of the art. They're the standard, which are always safe and acceptable. Exceeding these regulations is never necessary. May be prudent, but it's never absolutely necessary. The look at in the rectangular boxes here is you can use the original building code and define capacity to demand ratios. You can use then the current building code provisions, excluding seismic if seismic is small, and look at demand to capacity ratios. You then compare those, which you could do in a spreadsheet very easily, and this will give you an idea of where you're at. If the demand capacity ratios C1 are greater than the original design capacity ratios, then you go down the yes side, and that would be, as an example, current building codes are greater than the original design loads. On the other side is a no, and it tells you which document is then applicable. The last step is you can include seismic if you so desire. And this is how you approach it and go through it to make your decision. I'd like to stop here so that we've got a little bit of time if we could open it up for questions.
Hey, man, I agree with everything you've said. I think we're starting to use the code, and it's good. It's going to help a lot. We're constantly trying to educate people up the food chain from me, project managers, owners, etc. If I get pushback that IEBC hasn't adopted 562, and they'll say, Well, Jim, it's not been adopted by the building code. How can it be enforceable? And I get it. I know you're going to say it's been peer reviewed. It's by ACI. It's all these smart people have done a lot of work. Don't disagree with that. The problem is that the project managers above me will say it's not adopted by the code, so I'm not going to use it. Help me respond to them.
Okay. And this comes from what an attorney that's working with me on a lawsuit, current lawsuit, has told me. He's told me, one, 562 appends 318. And I know this is a term that makes a lot of people nervous. And the comment is, if you look in the IBC 318 is referenced, 318, if you say 562 is appending 318 for existing buildings, then you're set. Okay, so that's one way. Okay, that's the best way. I mean, that logic seemed pretty okay with me. The other way is, it is the current standard of care, and you are required legally to use the current standard of care. Okay? Anyone else?
Just a quick one. You mentioned it could apply to tanks, and from my practice, it's usually the ACI 350, yes, which would cover their design.
Yes.
So can you, I guess, talk about how maybe it might also append 350 as opposed to 318, or how would that work?
I think that you can apply it to tanks, but you're going to have to be careful about how you approach that. Ideally, your loads for tanks, yeah, I would think that current code provisions would be appropriate. I would look at fee factors in Chapter 5, and I would evaluate my structures using probably the fee factors in Chapter 5 and look at repairs. And the repairs won't make any difference. Chapter 5 is the same as 318, current 318. But it may help you on an initial evaluation of the structure when you get started looking at it. Okay? Thank you.